Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Donfried, and I have the privilege of leading the German Marshall Fund of the United States. A very warm welcome to all of you for an event that I'm very excited about on Europe's future. We have the great privilege of having 3 ambassadors to the United States from the United Kingdom, Sir Kim Darroch, from the European Union, David O'Sullivan, and from Germany, Peter Wittig. We have a particularly high-profile audience today, and I want to welcome the other members of the ambassadorial corps, some of the senior U.S. government officials who are here, as well as GMF trustees. We are very lucky that this on-the-record conversation, sorry, I caught your attention, Margaret. This is an on-the-record conversation, and it is in fact being live streamed, so everyone could smile for the cameras. But we are so lucky that this on-the-record conversation is being moderated by Margaret Brennan, who is known to many of you as CBS News Foreign Affairs correspondent. You have the full biographies of our speakers, so I'm going to limit myself to highlights of each of their resumes. As you know, our European partners send only their best diplomats here to Washington. Sir Kim came to Washington after having served as Prime Minister Cameron's national security advisor, where he had a front row seat on the formulation of the United Kingdom's EU policy, which was deeply informed by his own service in Brussels as UK permanent representative to the European Union. David O'Sullivan literally built the European External Action Service as the chief operating officer, and there are really very few people who have the breadth and depth of experience that he does on EU foreign policy making and policy making at the EU level in general. Peter Wittig brings his expert knowledge of German foreign policy, including having been posted to New York as Germany's ambassador to the United Nations, perhaps particularly relevant as we are nearing UNGA this year. And then we have Margaret Brennan, who has literally traveled the world and brings not only a deep understanding of geopolitics, but also of geoeconomics to our conversation this morning. So thanks to each and every one of you for being here this morning. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Margaret.
Thank you. And thank you so much to all of you and to our live audience there. We've got a great conversation lined up because there are so many topics right now that are really, as the premise for this conversation, add up to a stress test for Europe as a whole. And so I want to dive right into it. And of course, we have to start with the biggest question on everyone's minds, which is, what's going on with Brexit, Ambassador Darroch? I sort of feel like we should all leave the room and leave you two alone to have a very intense conversation to figure this one out. And you were quite frank ahead of this, saying we're figuring this out still. But your Prime Minister, Theresa May, who was meeting with President Obama just a few days ago, said, well, yes, we want to get on with it and file the divorce papers. It's not going to happen this year. Can you explain what's really driving the timeline here?
It's no secret, Margaret, that the government campaigned for a different outcome from the referendum, but the result was conclusive, and we are now set upon making a success of the next stage of our relations with Europe, which will involve leaving the European Union but negotiating new terms for relationship with the European Union member states. Now, the process, which I think David actually, he and I spent many years together in Brussels. I think he wrote Article 50, where he took a big part in the drafting. So thanks, David. But when you trigger it, you basically have 2 years to complete your negotiations for exit. And then at the end of that period, if there isn't a deal, then essentially the view of the sort of 27, with us as the 28th, I think prevails. And it's going to be a very complicated negotiation, lots of different aspects to it. And you have the problem, if you are the member state leaving, of what happens the moment that you actually leave and what arrangements prevail, particularly for trade. I think it's also fair to say that while clearly the Leave campaign in the UK fought a compelling campaign, and won the argument. They didn't present a single detailed blueprint for the future of Britain's relationships with the European Union countries.
Or any blueprint.
There were some ideas out there, but no single blueprint. So I think it's understandable that we're going to take a few months to work out exactly what our negotiating mandate, negotiating approach is, and then launch into negotiations. Now, Prime Minister May has said we won't launch Article 50, invoke Article 50 before the end of the year. She hasn't said when we will invoke it afterwards, but she's indicated that she understands that we need to get on with it. So I can't give you a date, but I can tell you it won't be before 31st of December. We'll see thereafter, but the period from now until then is about our working out our negotiating approach and strategy. And by the way, anyone who follows the British press might think that there is quite a lot going on that. I think that's understandable. There is bound to be a lively debate. We're an open democracy. We have a parliament. Of course, there will be lots of views expressed while we work it out, but we will get there.
Mm-hmm. So, Ambassador Sullivan, is this question number one in Bratislava on the 16th when everyone sits down?
Actually, I think probably not, in the sense I think Bratislava, maybe we can talk about that in a few moments, is more about how the 27 go forward together and what the agenda needs to be, and dealing with the many pressing issues which are out there, separate from Brexit. I mean, obviously I agree with much of what Kim has said. Jean-Louis Berlange, a French member of the European Parliament, wrote after the vote that before the referendum, the position of the United Kingdom to the EU was 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and after the referendum, the situation has been reversed. And you know, Paul Simon says there are 50 ways to leave your lover. I don't know if there are 50 forms of Brexit, but it's clear that we have had the political choice in the UK, and I think while many of us regret that and would have wished for a different outcome, we fully respect that democratic process. This is the decision that's been taken. This is now going to happen. We also respect, I think, that inevitably it's going to take a little bit of time for the UK to decide exactly how it wants to take this process forward and what it expects. So I think that we have to respect that. Obviously, on the other side, it's our union too. It's 28 in this, and I think the rights and concerns of the 27 have to be respected by the British government, which is that continued uncertainty over a long period of time is the enemy of us all, and so at some point we need to get some clarity about the process and the kind of time frame we're looking at in how we will solve these issues. As Kim says, there are two distinct issues. One is negotiating the separation. I don't know if I actually wrote Article 50. In fact, many people now seem to claim the authorship of this article. Frankly, until now, no one had ever heard of Article 50, or at least in European Commission parlance, it had an entirely different characterization, because it used to refer to the early retirement conditions for senior officials, so it was looked at in a completely different light. But it is clear that we've never done this before. Let's be honest, no country has ever left the EU. Well, we had the case of Greenland leaving in the very early 80s, but no country has left before. So we don't know exactly how we're going to have to go about this. My clear recollection is when we were writing Article 50, 2 years was kind of we should say it should be over quickly. 1 year is too quick. 3 years is too long. Let's put 2 years. So I'm not sure that anyone had scientifically worked out that this was exactly how long it would take to unravel the various legal and commercial and constitutional links which any country has once they join the European Union.
So that fall 2017 timeline isn't necessarily something that you even see as quite definitive.
No, the only thing that's definitive is the 2 years from the time you trigger the agreement, you trigger the request to leave.
Right.
It is obvious that the right to trigger that is in the hands of the country that is planning to leave. What is obvious, I think, or what is slightly difficult for some of the partners, and this has been clear in the statements of the European Council meeting in the immediate aftermath, is a prolonged period in which it is clear that the UK is going to leave, but they still don't actually formally trigger the process, is rather unsettling and difficult to manage for everyone. So I think, I don't know what a reasonable time frame is. We've understood that sometime into early next year, but I think at some point we need to trigger this process and enter into the mechanics of making this happen, which is the express wish of the British government and the British people. And only when you have Article 50 triggered, I think this is the important point perhaps to make, is only then can you have the structured negotiation that you need. Casual conversations, private talks between the British government and some of the institutions or with the other member states cannot substitute for the formal negotiations that will need to be triggered by the application under Article 50. And I'm sure Kim knows this from his Brussels experience. It's one thing talking to people bilaterally, it's another thing when the 27 actually sit down and start to formulate their position as to how they will react to whatever the British government puts on the table as its wishes and ideas for going forward.
Ambassador Wittig, looking at this, does your government now feel like it has to have some sort of argument to its own people to remind them that it may directly benefit them to stay in the EU? I mean, is there a vision to sell staying in that is now necessary because of some of these more difficult political forces, the rise of nationalism, protectionism, et cetera, that we are seeing? I mean, putting politics aside, since you may not be able to comment on that, do you think you need to sell the EU once again?
Well, first of all, thanks to the German Marshall Fund for organizing this and including me. It's a wonderful panel here. Fortunately, the German public opinion is one of the most pro-European in Europe, because the German people and the political circles, they realize we have benefited so much and continue to benefit from a thriving European Union. We are surrounded by 9 neighbors. It is one of the secrets of our economic prosperity. So there is no widespread anti-European feelings in my country, fortunately. But I think what is happening all over Europe, and to a certain extent also after the Brexit, which was a watershed moment in the European history, is a kind of soul searching about how to reinvigorate the European Union in those 27 member states. And I think that's a healthy debate. We've got to have it. But we also have to sort of unmask the truth behind all the anti-European rhetoric that is going on in those populist movements. Yes, we have to deliver better on the expectations of our citizens. We are not a union of bureaucrats. We are there for the citizens. Yes, we should not overregulate every single aspect of the life of the citizens. And you can find a couple of points where we really can do better. But I think the core mission, and that is still very convincing to our people, is that this is a peace project in the end. It has guaranteed our peace, stability, and prosperity for over 60 years, 50, 60 years after the war. And it is sort of the guarantee of our well-being in Europe. It's a tremendous success story. And I think the challenge now is to bring this home again to the European citizens. And I think we are in that debate. A lot of good ideas out there. I'm confident that also Brexit contributes to bring this 27 closer together. So don't write Europe off.
Mm-hmm. There's been a fair amount of coverage, certainly outside of this country, about the political difficulty that Angela Merkel may now be encountering. And you were seeing some of that regional elections with some, as you just referenced, some anti-European, anti-immigrant, some more far-right sentiment that is cropping up. What do you attribute that to? Is that economic? Is that about the migration crisis writ large? And are you taking that seriously, given
absolutely.
that you just said you don't see membership in the EU as a problem?
Absolutely. It's first and foremost about the refugees, about immigration. And that has sort of hit the German political landscape a little bit belatedly. And this new party that has been emerging in the recent regional elections, that is more or less a single issue party that expresses and voices frustration about the number of refugees and immigrants coming to our country. That's a challenge, and that is sort of a new fact that we've got to deal with. It's less related to the European Union. It's more related to the immigration issue. I think that as much as we can contain the numbers of refugees coming in, and I think they have been contained pretty successfully, and as much as we can show that we make incremental progress in integrating those refugees, this protest vote hopefully will wane.
So when other European ambassadors are asking you how politically vulnerable your chancellor is, how do you respond to that question?
Well, this new party has, in a way, changed the parameters of the party system, but we have a healthy system of democratic parties. We have a 5% threshold to get into parliament. We have a vote next year in September, a year from now, national elections. I'm not clairvoyant, but I think one thing is certain. The polls say the chancellor still enjoys a broad support, even in some polls the majority of the people supporting her refugee policy, and that is something that she will build upon.
And quickly, can I ask you, what's the daily number of Syrian refugees or refugees at large that Germany is still taking in now?
Well, it has been brought down from about 10,000 a day, still last November, to two-digit number, or sometimes one-digit number per day now. So you can see the dramatic slowdown of refugees coming to Germany, basically thanks to that agreement of the European Union with Turkey. Turkey is the great gateway from Syria and Iraq to the European Union, and that has helped, among other factors, to bring down the numbers. That's why we appreciate very much this agreement, and we have a vital interest that it holds, and that is, although relations to Turkey have been bumpy lately, we have an interest in maintaining Turkey as a vital partner in this.
And 10,000 is what the U.S. roughly decided to take in for the full year. So it gives you some appreciation for the scale of the flood that you were experiencing. Ambassador O'Sullivan, do you think that agreement between EU and Turkey is solid there? Turkey having taken in millions of refugees.
Yeah, I mean, we've had certainly a major increase in refugees and asylum seekers in Europe, but we've always been conscious and always acknowledged that, in fact, the frontline countries taking the bulk of the responsibility from the conflict in Syria are, of course, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And by the way, we're the largest, the European Union and its member states are the largest humanitarian donors to the Syrian crisis, going back now 5, 6, 7 years. We've been by far the largest donors to those countries because we recognize precisely the huge pressures which this has put on them. And we should never forget the situation in Lebanon, the situation in Jordan, and of course Turkey. And we're very grateful for the large numbers that Turkey has taken. This is why part of the deal that Peter referred to was a very substantial financial commitment to Turkey, in the order potentially of 6 billion, not, and this is very important because I think this is sometimes misunderstood, not to the Turkish government as such. It was not a transfer from the EU to Turkey. It was a transfer from the EU to help Turkey manage the consequences of the some 3 million refugees that they have taken. And we are delivering aid via the NGOs and via the international organizations to provide housing, education, medical care, and other forms of assistance to those refugees, precisely because in recognition of the enormous effort that Turkey is making in housing so many.
But Turkey's got plenty of its own internal political problems right now, as well as this question as to what its role is going to be in the actual crisis that's creating that flood of refugees. So are you not concerned about the stability of that agreement itself, since they are the bulwark that is preventing that flood from going back to the levels that we heard the ambassador describe?
Well, I mean, I think in these situations, volatility is inevitable. But I think first and foremost, all of us have to take the view that this is a humanitarian crisis. I mean, and we have an international responsibility to the people who are fleeing Syria, the greatest humanitarian crisis we've had in living memory, probably. Some 11 million displaced Syrians, and a whole generation, unfortunately, probably of Syrian young children who will not have gone to school. I mean, which is something that we could pay a price for going forward in a terrible way. So I think we have to make a distinction between the political debate about how we solve the problem, and we welcome very much what's happened over the weekend with the agreement between the US and Russia, and we hope that we can find a solution there, and Turkey has its role in that. At the same time, we have the very real problem of managing the welfare of these people who are displaced in neighboring countries and in Europe. And I think we have to keep that effort going, and I think Turkey, we believe that this deal will be maintained. It's also in Turkey's interest.
The US-Russia deal?
No, sorry, the deal between the EU and Turkey.
The EU-Turkey.
Deal on refugees. We think it's a deal which delivers for both sides, frankly. It also has elements which support Turkey. Turkey has just recently agreed to send additional liaison officers now to Greece. And really the outflow, as my German colleague Peter was saying, has dropped from thousands to perhaps about 50 a day coming across the Aegean into Greece. There's still a problem of people who are in Greece, but we are progressively resettling people both out of Turkey. We've now moved people from camps in Turkey into other European Union countries. We're moving people out of Greece into other European countries. The problem is now shifting very much to Italy, who of course has been a frontline state in this for many years and frankly made huge efforts, humanitarian efforts. We should not forget that we've rescued nearly 240,000 people in the Mediterranean with our military, our naval efforts over the last couple of years. But there is now a growing problem, particularly in northern Italy, because many of the people coming out of Libya are going there. So this is a problem whose nature will shift constantly in function of the evolving situation. So you'll fix it in one area and then you'll find it'll pop up elsewhere. And we do need, and that's why the European Commission has come forward with proposals for strengthening legal pathways, for legal migration, for revisiting the asylum, the functioning of the Dublin system and the asylum and refugee system, more European solidarity within our member states in dealing with these issues so that frontline states don't have to bear the burden of this. This is going to take time to reshape all this, but I think we are gradually getting a better grip on the situation, and it is somewhat less of a crisis now than it was a year ago.
How many Syrian refugees does the UK take in, or has it committed to take in?
We've committed
within
to
a
take,
year again.
committed to take 20,000 over the next 3 or 4 years, I mean by 2020. And so far we have taken 3,000. So in terms of the numbers coming in and the kind of forward track, we are on track to deliver 20,000 in that timescale.
And that won't be affected by some of the change in government and other policies,
Well, I
perhaps?
think the commitment is there, and Brexit negotiations are a different issue, so it's not going to be affected by that.
But migration and immigration is very much an issue right now. You see
Migration and
this as
immigration
separate.
is very much an issue in the UK, as it is in most of the rest of the developed world. And I mean, if that's where you're going, Margaret, there is no doubt that of the various elements that lay behind the majority vote for leaving the European Union, I mean, the slogan about regaining control was very effective, and that was about regaining control of our laws, of the right of Parliament to make sovereign decisions in all areas, but most of all, I think, about regaining control of borders. So there's no doubt that that was a big issue in that debate. All that said, we are taking 20,000 and we are committed to that. We are also, I think, we are the biggest, certainly the biggest European bilateral donor in terms of putting $3 billion into the refugee effort. As David said, Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey are taking a huge amount of the burden, and we're putting a lot of bilateral money into that. The other factor, if I can just throw in, is I think the figures were last year that about half of the total refugee flow were refugees from Syria, but the rest, a lot were economic migrants from other countries in the region, whether in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Eritrea, West Africa. And the comprehensive policy which the European Union is working on, which the Commission are leading on, has got to include and will include policies to look at the source countries of economic migrants and to try and make those more viable places for people to live and work, so that they don't feel this motivation to come to Europe.
Well, what you referenced there, Ambassador O'Sullivan, the deal between the U.S. and Russia, I think is supposed to go into effect right about this hour. It was around sundown Damascus time, and one of the justifications for John Kerry brokering this deal with the Russians was to help staunch the flow of refugees, blaming the barrel bombing in Syria with really being one of the main drivers of people fleeing for all the countries that you just described. So if it's not just writing humanitarian checks, which the US does and many do, but actually also forcing an end to the conflict, does Boris Johnson then get more roll up the sleeves and digging into brokering deals like that, or brokering deals in some of the other conflict zones? I mean, what does this force you in terms of foreign policy shifts because of the immigration crisis itself?
That's a good question. First thing to say is that John Kerry has done, it's been an extraordinary effort by him. He actually came round to the British Embassy last week to do a video conference into a big meeting in London where we launched the Syrian High Negotiating Committee. And he was off within 24 hours on his aeroplane to Geneva to do the deal with Lavrov. No one could have worked harder than he has, and he deserves a huge amount of credit and appreciation for those efforts. Second, of course, we now need to see the deal stick, and you're right, I think the deadline for the ceasefire starting is in the next hour or two, and it needs to sit there for 7 days, and then other things come into play, and somewhere down the track we need a resumption of the political process. Let's be clear, we can all do more, no question, on helping with humanitarian consequences, but the answer has to be to try and find a political solution, a more inclusive government for Syria. Needs to be eventually at some point the exit of the guy who barrel bombs and uses chemical weapons against his own citizens, and a political solution there that enables us to put Syria together as a functioning country and to start to repair the extraordinary both human and material damage that has been done there. So ultimately we all have to support and work towards a political solution,
So
and that's the priority.
Does that mean UK sanctions on Russia, which is a very difficult proposition to continue down that road of adding to that pressure? Just reopened relations fully with Iran. Does that mean more pressure on Iran on behalf of the UK
Well, I think the first stage, and let's hope
to help it stick, as you say.
Let's hope that the deal that John Kerry has done with his Russian counterpart sticks. But the first stage is diplomacy to try and keep the Russians on board with the deal and make that work, and get Iranian support for it. So if there are going to be different forms of pressure down the track, well, let's wait and see how things develop. But at the moment, if we can get a cooperative process going, then that's the best solution.
But primarily still a US-Russia deal.
Yeah, I mean, John Kerry and the State Department team have been extremely assiduous at keeping us in more or less hour-to-hour contact with what is going on. As I say, he took an hour and a half out of his time to come to the embassy on Wednesday to beam himself into the conference going on in London. He talks to our foreign secretary, as I'm sure he does to the German foreign minister, almost daily on this stuff. So we feel part of the process, but it's sensible that he leads negotiations.
Well, one place that the EU, and certainly your country, has been at the forefront of is the other big challenge with Russia and Ukraine. It seems every year or two when we raise the question once again, is the peace process, is Minsk going anywhere? The answer is no. Right now we've seen more of a buildup from Russia, according to US sources at least. And you have the question of whether the EU can maintain sanctions. Almost each and every time it's up to the wire, there's a debate about it. What do you see happening there? Because your chancellor really has been the conduit to Vladimir Putin that the US has relied on here.
You're right. My country, together with France, is engaged in that Minsk group, together with Russia and the Ukraine. We thought that is the best forum to contain that conflict and eventually solve it in East Ukraine. It was not entirely feckless, Margaret, because
That's
the
a great
numbers,
quote.
the numbers of casualties, the numbers of dead are down. So if you look at the history, the fighting has subsided. It has waxed and waned, but the numbers of casualties are down compared to the beginning of that conflict. But you're right, we're not happy with the progress in that Minsk process. But nobody has dissociated himself or herself from that process, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians. So we keep on working on that. You should
But does
know
Russia ever really? I mean, the diplomacy is always a path that continues while the military has a different strategy. At least that's been the case in Syria.
we believe
Is it
that
running out the clock diplomatically?
we believe that Russia has not done enough to exert influence on the separatists to comply with certain security aspects of that Minsk agreement, and could and should do more. And mind you, the sanctions that are imposed on Russia are twofold. Crimea-related sanctions, they will stay. And then Eastern Ukraine-related sanctions. And we will judge the question whether to relieve sanctions or prolong them. We will judge that on the implementation of Minsk. And that will be sort of the litmus test at the end of the year, when the leaders of the 28 are called upon to prolong them. And I think if we don't see another Russian behavior, then the likelihood that they will be prolonged is pretty high.
Ambassador, what do you think? Can you actually strengthen those sanctions, not just renew them in December?
Well, we've always been very clear. I mean, on the European side, I think both the Iran sanctions and the Ukraine sanctions, or Ukraine-linked sanctions against Russia, have been both a success story of the European Union and a success story of transatlantic cooperation. And I think it's been very clear that if we had a successful Iran deal, and I know there are some people in Washington who still don't like that deal, but for those of us who believe it was a good deal, it was in large measure the European sanctions the toughened European sanctions which brought Iran back to the table. I think people have been surprised by the toughness of the sanctions which we were able to put in place against Russia, both on the issue of Crimea and on the issue of the eastern provinces, and on the unity which we have maintained. Of course, we're 28 countries, we're democracies. There's always a debate when it comes up to renew it. Some people say, well, are these working? And sanctions are not in themselves a policy. They're a tool, they're an instrument to help deliver certain policy outcomes. And I think the possibility of increasing the sanctions is always there if it is felt that this would be productive. I think the main issue, exactly as Peter has said, is to make progress in the Minsk format. If we don't, I think sanctions will have to be maintained. If there were to be a deterioration of the situation, that would be a new situation which we have not yet had to.
You don't think that's the case right
with.
now?
I think that the situation, it depends on deteriorating relative to what. I think, as Peter has said, that since Minsk has been there, the situation has improved, but it ebbs and flows. And this is the assessment which has to be made, and that's an assessment which will be made at the end of the year when they come up for renewal again. And I think if there is not significant change in the situation, then in my view the sanctions will indeed be maintained, and the pressure will continue to be there on Russia to change its behavior. So I think actually we've been remarkably good at maintaining both transatlantic and intra-European unity on this issue.
The UK, and I want to go to questions in the audience. I see we've got a microphone here, but let me just have you weigh in on this, because you brought up the example of Iran sanctions. It's a much tougher proposition within Europe because of the direct hit in many ways to European pocketbooks because of the financial ties with Russia. And the US has always thought UK was sort of our guy in the room, so to speak, US diplomats would say, within the EU to help maintain things. Do you foresee problems?
Well, look, first of all,
with
we're
the
still in
strength
the
of
room. We'll be in the room in December when this comes around.
Right.
3 points on this.
But
First of
beyond
all,
December, since that's so murky.
First of all, we support the Minsk process and the trajectory that it sets out leading towards a political solution here. Second, as both Peter and David have hinted, there is no moral parity here. I mean, Russia and Ukraine are both involved in the negotiating process, but it's Russia that has annexed a piece of another country's territory and that has destabilized eastern Ukraine by supporting separatist forces. And let's be clear, there have at times been Russian forces in eastern Ukraine as well. So, third point, we will, unless things change, unless Minsk is implemented, we will be supporting a rollover of sanctions in December. And I'm with David in thinking that actually it has, you can argue that it's not what we would have expected, that we've managed to roll this over, I think, 3 times already. So actually Europe has shown real steadfastness and solidity on this issue in a way that some observers might not have expected. And if Minsk is in the state it is now, which I hope it isn't, I hope it gets a lot of progress over the next few months, but if it's where it is now, then we will certainly be supporting rollover in December.
Keeping hope alive on Ukraine. Let's. Do we have some questions in the audience? If that's the microphone, I think we'll bring it to you. If you could raise your hand, I will call on you. I think right here. About 4 chairs back. If you could just say your name and where you're from.
My name is Yelena Franceschi, and I work for Voice of America. And I would like to ask all 3 of you, how does Europe and individual countries in Europe view Putin as a foe, friend, partner, semi-partner, because of this sort of a very complicated relationship concerning Ukraine and Syria?
They're going into their diplomatic playbooks to looking at synonyms and Ambassador Wittig.
Well, I think it's not my task to give marks on leaders, and I would also say that if you ask what is Germany thinking about Putin, you would get different voices, so it's difficult to answer that question in that general sense. Putin is the president of an important neighbor of ours, a giant geographically, an important country, a country that influences our lives in Europe. So we have traditionally very close relations to Russia and to its leaders. The Chancellor is a personality that talks to the Russian president very frequently. She happens to speak his language. He happens to speak her language, so that helps sometimes. We have no alternative, whether we agree or disagree with Putin's policies, to have a dialogue with him. And sometimes we're being criticized to be too ready to talk to him on various conflicts in the world and in Europe, but we see no alternative, and it is imperative for European security, with all the disagreements that we have with the Russian leadership, and there are many, to be on speaking terms with the Russian leadership and with Putin.
I think that's the word frenemy.
Yeah, I mean, look, for the last 20 years, until the annexation of Crimea, the whole thrust of European policy was to have a partnership with Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which treated it as a full member of the community of nations, a democracy, a major partner, a hugely important player on the European continent, straddling Europe right through to Asia. Everything we were doing went in that direction, including trying to negotiate new trade arrangements, supporting Russia's accession to the WTO, membership of the G7, G8. And I think that's the fundamental posture, frankly, of most people in Europe towards Russia. Now, that changed dramatically with the annexation of Ukraine. This was a major game changer. It came as a shock. It was the first time that we had seen a forcible change of frontiers in this way, completely contrary to the whole security architecture. So this came as a major shock to the system, and that's why there has been the reaction that we've just been discussing. And I think we have to push back on that, and we have to push back on the interference in eastern Ukraine and reassert the sovereignty of Ukraine and the right of Russia's neighbors to decide their own future. So I think this is a very fundamental point. Having said that, what has not gone away is the need ultimately to have a better long-term relationship with Russia and to try to have a more normal relationship. And I think that's the two objectives that we are all able to agree on. I mean, where there are perhaps nuances between our 28 member states are those who would put more emphasis on the pushback and those who would put more emphasis on the need to reach out. But ultimately, they coalesce around the policies we have now, which is a mixture of both. And I think that's the challenge. We do not wish to be in a permanent long-term confrontation with Russia. We do not wish to challenge Russia's right to choose who is their leader through a democratic process, but we want to see Russia playing its full and active part in the international community of nations in full respect of international law and the development of democracy, human rights, and social progress and economic progress, which we wish for in Russia, and which unfortunately has not happened in recent years, precisely because some of the policies followed have not led them in that direction, and we regret that.
But beyond Ukraine, has Russia been a force for good in Europe?
Well, I don't know if you qualify countries as being a force for good or you know.
Well, there's quite
it's a sort of moral judgment about the nature of countries.
Yeah, but there's a lot of conversation about direct intervention in elections. Certainly in this country, there's concern, often citing European countries as an example, about why people in this country should be concerned. It's speculative, but Europe is often held up as the reason people harbor those suspicions.
Well, I've probably spoken longer. I have to give Kim his chance. The point I'm making is simply that ultimately we need to be in a situation where we can have the most normal relations possible with a democratic Russia. And that has been the objective of our policy and will continue to be. Now, does that mean we agree with everything that they're doing? Does that mean do we have issues both in terms of the domestic, the position of civil society, or the development of human rights, or their external policy? Of course, there are challenges and conflicts. And we have to manage those, and we have to be firm in defending our values and our principles. But at the same time, I think we really need to keep that sort of medium-term objective that we do not want to descend into a permanent and open confrontation with the people of Russia in the long term, because that's not in our interests and not in their interests. Now, how we manage that is tricky, to be frank, in the present situation, and it's going to be just as, for example, working with Russia on Syria or working with Russia on the Iran deal requires you to be a little bit able to compartmentalize certain things, because you have to also have a little element of realpolitik in your defense of values.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador
over to you, Kim.
Thank you.
You had the most time to think about how to answer this question.
Yes.
So does that mean you'll be the most frank?
Maybe. Speaking from the British government, I think the word partnership is one that we would struggle to use in current circumstances in terms of the relationship with our bilateral relationship with Russia, simply because of what Russia has done in Ukraine and their position on issue like Syria, where they are supporting someone who we don't think should be leading Syria, and if it weren't for Russian support, I'm not sure that Assad would still be in power. We also pick up a lot of reports about, which you alluded to, about Russian involvement with certain political parties in Europe, things going on the border between NATO and Russia that have prompted NATO to strengthen that eastern border, Russian involvement with media outlets in Europe that worry us. So partnership is not a word that seems to us to fit at the moment. All that said, we have important economic interests, notably in energy, with both of our big energy companies involved in Russia. It's, as Peter and David have both said, an extremely important country in terms of trying to resolve the global challenges that face us, particularly in the Middle East. And so we believe strongly, whatever our reservations about Russian policy in engagement with them, that meant Theresa May, as one of her first meetings as Prime Minister of the G20, had a bilateral with Putin. And you will see our new ministers engaging a lot with their Russian counterparts over the next few months. So Russia is an important player. It's essential you keep talking to them. It's essential you develop a whole range of links and relationships with the Russian people. But at the moment, we don't really see them as entirely constructive members of the global community.
Here we go. We go here and here.
Hi, I'm Stefan Groby. I'm with Euronews. Ambassador Darroch, what will be the priorities of British foreign policy once Brexit is completed? And also, I read with interest that you studied zoology. Now leads me to ask the question, if the European Union were an animal, what would that be, in your opinion?
I think you should have given me notice of the second part of the question. Look, on priorities of British foreign policy, Brexit, or talk about it correctly, negotiating the terms of our exit from the European Union and the nature of the new relationship with Europe is going to be a big priority, obviously, over the next couple of years or so. So that's got to sit at the centre of the stage. But we are the second biggest military power in NATO. I think we probably have the biggest defence expenditure in Europe. We're engaged in Syria, in Iraq, on Libya, in Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, and the fact that we are leaving the European Union doesn't mean that we're kind of sailing off somewhere mid-Atlantic and leaving Europe. We will continue to stay deeply involved in European politics and security as well. Look, the biggest challenge outside the Brexit negotiations with the EU box at the moment is the challenge of international terrorism and extremism as represented by ISIL and Al-Qaeda, as demonstrated by these terrifying and appalling events in Europe. We ourselves have had, I think, 8 plots that we've managed to disrupt on UK soil in the last 2 years, and any security expert will tell you, while that's an exceptional performance by our intelligence security people, there's going to be sometimes someone is going to get through this. So we need constant vigilance there, and we need policies not just domestically over our security, but internationally to try to address the root causes of ISIL and Al-Qaeda and extremism and terrorism. Beyond that, look, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and you just need to look at what's happened in the recent weeks with North Korea. Another nuclear test, we think, only last week, and several missile firings, and North Korea as an emerging non-proliferation threat is something for all of us. Look at the tensions in the South China Sea. Look at what's going on in Africa. There's any number of global issues out there which the UK, as an internationally minded country, will want to be part of finding solutions to and addressing. And last heading from me, we remain fundamentally strong believers in free trade and in open markets. Free trade has taken a battering in the US election campaign, we notice. We hope that the needle can swing back on the dial, and that we can make progress, whether on TTIP, or we would hope that the US government get TPP through. But for us, global prosperity needs to be built on more free trade agreements and more global trade.
Do you want to answer the zoology question?
Oh, yeah. Give me 5 minutes to think about it.
We have a gentleman here, and then we'll move to this side of the room.
Jonathan from the IMF. I suppose for the next 2 to 3 years we have a situation where the UK is politically on its way out from the EU, but is legally still a member. My question to both the Commission and the UK perspective is during this period when the EU will be taking many important decisions on many matters. Will the UK seek to influence those decisions? Will it be in a position to do so? Will it be allowed to participate? Or in effect, will the UK be completely absent from all important European decisions from now on?
There is a simple answer to that, which is any decision which involves either needing consensus or which involves a qualified majority vote on a piece of legislation. By definition, we have a vote and we have a say until the day we leave, and so yes, we will be involved in those decisions. I think it's for others to say whether, when they are thinking about longer-term strategy, whether it's on relations with Russia or a comprehensive policy to address the migration crisis or whatever, how they will react to our input. But I am sure that we will continue to input, because we can't help ourselves. We have opinions on everything. So we will continue to say what we think. I mean, I sat around that table for almost 5 years, and I always got lots and lots of briefing on what London thought about everything that was going on. So we will continue to say that news. But whether others feel that they take less account of them, it's for them to say. I hope not.
But after, I think it's a fair question for you to also weigh in on, Ambassador Sullivan. I mean, after those 2 to 3 years, does the UK get to weigh in on any major European issue?
No, well, I think the point of Donald's question was, after they leave, it's clear they are no longer round the table in the same way.
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know whether on issues like security and foreign policy we will wish in some way nonetheless to have an association with the UK, but it will not be as a member of the EU. And legally speaking, they will not be able to input on any of the decisions of the European Union at that point. The issue, I think, goes to the formal legal situation, which is exactly as Kim has described it. Until the day they are not a member, they are a member. And I think it's hugely important, by the way, in this whole debate, because Brexit has not yet taken place. There are people who think it's already happened on the 23rd of June and who are saying, well, actually, I think things are going quite well because nothing's changed. Well, of course, nothing's changed because nothing's happened yet. And we will see how and when and in what form it happens. But in the interim period, the legal position will be exactly as Kim has said. The UK will remain a full member. That is why, by the way, they will continue to have a commissioner, and the Sir Julian King, the commissioner designate from the UK, is undergoing, I think, his hearing in Strasbourg as we speak of the European Parliament, and will sit around the table of the College of Commissioners until such time as the UK leaves. And anything which requires a formal decision, a qualified majority vote, or even a vote at unanimity will need a UK vote. The question of whether, as we move through the process and it becomes more and more clear that the UK is leaving and that the date becomes more clear, a question of diminishing marginal returns undoubtedly will apply, and people may decide, well, the UK, if voting against this can block it, well, in 6 months' time they'll be gone, so we'll put it to a vote in 6 months' time. I mean, some element of that as you end the period in which it becomes very clear that there's a date for leaving. But in the meantime, the UK remains a full legal member of the European Union with all the rights and responsibilities that implies, including full solidarity with all European positions, particularly in the area of trade, for example.
Okay.
Some trade wonks in the audience, obviously.
I'm Harlan Ullman, chairman of a UK company that is anticipating the execution of Brexit is precisely that. I'd like to ask or invite the ambassadors to get themselves into serious trouble by answering how they are explaining the state of the current American presidential campaign to their governments and public, and how they see America after January 20th in terms of being a stable ally. What Donald Trump has been saying has been frightening to most reasonable Americans. His campaign will be out to besmirch Hillary Clinton over emails, health care, and the Clinton Foundation. And if she does win office, she will be politically damaged and is favoring a number of policies that seem to be anti-European, such as opposing TTIP.
What's
so
the
how do you
question?
explain?
The question is?
The question is, how do you explain the current state of the American political presidential process to your governments and publics? And how do you see explaining whether or not America is going to be a reliable partner in the future, no matter who wins the election?
Well, I imagine there are 2 different conversations, one public, one private. But most pundits had a hard time talking about this election, most American pundits. So it's a fair question. Being here and being the eyes on the ground in Washington, how do you explain it back home? Ambassador Wittig?
Well, we are on the record,
Yes,
and therefore I cannot share with you all my thoughts that I share in more intimate conversations. Of course, we have an interest as a European country, as a NATO ally, to have a reliable leader, a leader that is capable, that takes into consideration the concerns of allies. So that is our perspective. And of course, we are a country, as others are, that have some skin in the game in this election. So I know that American voters are the ones who decide, but they decide about the next leader, about the next president, but they also decide who will be the leader of the Western world. And in that capacity, belonging to that species, we look at that, of course, with great interest. And the one thing I think it was mentioned before, the one thing that surprised us as many observers is how rough a treatment the free trade got here during the campaign. Basically, spurned by the outsiders, if you will, in this race, and it has now led to a situation where the free traders here have to really point to the advantages and have to really go out of their way to remind people that free trade has been one of our key pillars of the prosperity of our country. So that's maybe a surprise that I experienced in this campaign, and of course where we reported back on. But there were many other surprises that we reported back, which I don't want to share with you here.
But the fact that both Democrats and Republicans, or both their nominees, are against free trade agreements is most concerning to you. Is that where you point?
I think Ambassador Wittig, in his new capacity as chairman and convener of the Trade Association of Diplomats in Washington, has very accurately stated the fact that our confidential cables will have to remain something which only future historians will read. I mean, how difficult? I mean, I think it is a challenge to explain. I mean, I leave aside the fact that none of us can take a position, and none of us here are going to, on the record, take a position in your domestic debate. But I think it has been a very unpredictable electoral process, and all the people in our embassies and delegation who've been working on this for many, many years all tell us that, it's been very unusual. And by the way, one of the challenges of reporting from Washington is the fact that there's so much coverage that all the people in Europe read it in real time anywhere. I mean, the difficulty is to say something additional that may add value compared to what people can read on their websites every morning when they wake up, because your election is getting massive coverage all over the world, and people are very well informed about it. Whether this is an election that will yield at some point a sort of very big shift in American thinking and policy, we will wait to see. It's a question people are asking, and you'll be the ones to decide on the 8th of November, and that's probably the most fundamental question that people are thinking about. But it is a great privilege to be here and witness this, and there is a sense in which this is an election which is rather different from previous ones, though maybe there's a temptation always to think that about every election. But
I think it's a fair
followed.
assessment.
Yeah,
I think you're
it's
safe on
followed.
that.
It's followed very, very closely.
Ambassador Darroch, I mean, at a minimum, please weigh in on that, but can you give us any insight into what you use as your sourcing on this election, given how many pundits, very well-established Washington watchers, got a lot of the projections wrong?
Yeah.
As a foreign government, how do you guess right?
Yeah, good question. First of all, as Peter said, it's important to us. It's important, who is the leader of the free world? And we care about institutions, we care about NATO, we care about free trade. So who is American president is hugely important. Second, it is, I think all American elections are fascinating, and ours, they're over in 6 weeks. Yours are a little bit longer than that, and so there's a great deal of time to get to know the candidates and to watch it unfold. And it's, it has its soap opera qualities. I mean, it's extraordinary, the twists and turns. And this is, I think, as David said, an extraordinary election. So I think they're always interesting. I do think this one is a bit different. Third point I'd say is I was here privately back in November before I took up the job, just because I wanted to see some bits of America that I hadn't seen before, notably in the south of the country. And my predecessor laid on a lunch with political pundits then, all of whom said back in November that there was an interesting phenomenon on the Republican side. This particular individual would certainly not be the candidate. So every political pundit around that table was wrong. And nowadays, when you talk to them, I think it was summed up by one, I better not name, who said, basically, when it comes to predicting this election, no one knows anything. And if anyone tells you they do, they're wrong. And that's kind of what we keep saying to London when they keep saying, so what's going to happen? Tell us who's going to win. But I did notice that when I went down to the south of the country, I drove from Nashville down to New Orleans, as you would say, New Orleans, and there was a very different feel to the politics there and to who the people you talked to were supporting than you find in Washington. So there's a big difference, it feels to me, between inside the Washington Beltway and outside. Last thing, since it's about explanation, my own reporting must remain private like everyone else's, but I am struck by some really high quality analysis in the American media about what is going on here and about the impact of globalization on much of middle America and how that is playing and how this election is playing out. And of course there are parallels with the impact of globalization in other Western democracies, including my own. So there is something quite fascinating around that, not to go into more detail about it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have another question here?
Hi, I'm Jack Sullivan from Congressman Peter Rossum's office. This is for Ambassador Darroch. Following Britain's exit from the EU, do its leaders see an opportunity to shift the country's emphasis from Europe to the other English-speaking countries of the world, like United States, Australia, Canada, even India? And if so, how would that unfold?
As I've said earlier, we're not about to kind of sail away from the European continent and deny thousands of years of history or our involvement in and interests, national interests in security and stability and prosperity in Europe. So we are not leaving Europe. We like to think that we have a global outlook, and so of course relations with the English-speaking world have always been important to us. How will it be manifested? As and when we are in a position to negotiate bilateral trade deals, I'm sure the Australias and Canadas and indeed the United States of this world will be amongst the first places we will turn to for bilateral trade deals. But as David would be quick to remind me if I got this wrong, the first priority has to be negotiate the terms of our departure from the European Union, and you can't either technically or even kind of logistically start doing those bilateral trade deals till you're a great deal further down that path than we are. But always have a global political outlook. We'll always have a global outlook in terms of our interest in security and defense issues. And when it comes to free trade post our exit from the European Union, we will be, I promise you, out there for free trade deals with anyone who's interested.
I was with President Obama when he was in London and gave that line that worried so many folks in the UK, you'll be at the back of the queue. Is there thought to try to get some kind of trade deal going parallel to negotiating your exit?
Well, in fact, the Prime Minister and President discussed this, amongst other things, in their first bilateral in the G20. And the answer is that, yes, of course, we will want to get into informal discussions at some point in the future with the US government about a free trade deal. The US takes 17% of our exports, so it's by far the biggest, most important partner that we have on trade. But as the Prime Minister and President agreed, for the US administration in its last few months, the priority is to make progress on TTIP and to see if there's a prospect of getting TPP through in Congress. For us, the priority is to negotiate or establish the mandate for our negotiations for our departure from the European Union. So both of us, for the moment, have other things to focus on.
Okay. Do you have more questions? This gentleman on the end there by the fireplace.
I see with a little bit of alarm recent developments in Europe, and I see that we have actually not a trend to greater unity, but to greater fragmentation. We have the Brexit, then you hear Nicola Sturgeon talking about Scotland becoming independent. Yesterday was a big event in Barcelona, and the governor of Catalonia said he wants an independent Catalonia by the middle of next year. I think it's like in a marriage, if something goes sour, things happen very early on when you don't realize it. But I see this with quite some alarm that there is this fragmentation. Is there anything which the European Union officials think they can do about this or stem that, or is the problem not even recognized?
I'm sorry, would you just say your name and where you're from?
Werner Graf from Howard University.
Well, I mean, I think you need to be careful in how you, there are different ways to characterize it. I mean, going back to Kim's point about the US election and the impact of globalization and a sense of disempowerment which many of our citizens feel faced with globalization and those trends, I think there is a renewed emphasis on the local, on trying to bring things back to the most local level possible, and that's why you get movements in different parts of Europe of people feeling they want to be better able to shape their local environment. At the same time, this goes with the fact that you can only do that if you are part of a structure that actually provides you with the global interface. And I think that is precisely what the European Union has been trying to do. And I mean, the difference between us and the United States is the great motto here is a pluribus unum, creating one out of a conglomerate of different people from different oranges. Europe has always been unity and diversity. We have never sought a homogenization. We've never sought to extinguish the very strong differences which are felt between our member states and even within our member states. I mean, Peter Wittig could talk to you about Germany and its federal structure and how strongly people identify with their land, and how strongly in France even, which is a rather unitary state, but how strongly people identify with their region or their département. So I think these two things can coexist. So I'm not at all disagreeing with you that we are going through a phase now where people are perhaps going more towards the local and less towards the unifying factors. But I think ultimately you can bring these two things together. That has been the challenge in Europe. That's what we've been trying to do, is unify where it is in our best interest. So in trade policy, in aspects of foreign policy, development cooperation, the single market, to make that work for our citizens, but at the same time allowing the maximum freedom of action for our member states and for sub-federal structures within our member states to express their own cultural, local preferences. And when you travel around Europe, it is anything but homogenized. So how you get that balance is not easy. And it will probably continue to be a challenge in Europe. It's probably one of the things they will discuss in Bratislava for the 27, now that the UK has decided no longer to be part of this unique experiment. What are the things that we need to do as Europeans? What are the things that we should leave entirely to member states or sub-regional level? And what are the areas where maybe we should have a looser form of cooperation? This is a constant debate that will ebb and flow for the next 50 or 60 years. But I think it's a mistake to always feel that when people make a local assertion that this is necessarily against the idea of an overarching European cooperation and unity in the way that we've been striving. But it's a debate, I could say, going back to the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers here, it's a debate you're not unfamiliar with. You have, of course, a much more robust constitutional structure and tradition, and you have this great commitment to a single identity, which we do not have and which we probably never will have in Europe. But people have to learn to have to coexist with a European identity and a national identity and a local identity. Personally, I feel very Irish, but in being Irish, I feel very much from Dublin, and I feel very European. And I also feel, frankly, a certain global citizenship. And I don't see any of that as being contradictory in terms of making a contribution at each of those levels. But maybe that's too philosophical a response for the average voter. I don't know.
Yeah, can I add something to it? And I'm very much agreeing with David here. I think what we are seeing in Europe is a new quest for identity. And I think that has driven a lot of people to vote for Brexit in the UK. And that is driving some of those in Catalonia and other countries, sort of, be it local, be it regional, be it national identity. Maybe that is also now an effect of globalization. It hits you, maybe it hits us all a little bit lately, but that seems to be a new trend. A lot of those populist movements now are tapping into that feeling. And I think here we have to be aware of this quest of our identity. We have to be mindful of it. We have to get the balance right, as David outlined. But we also have to be very vociferous when it comes to scapegoating the European for everything that goes wrong in individual member states. I think the European Union, the EU institutions are now the easiest target in a blame game when anything in our individual member states goes wrong. And there, I think we have to go into the offensive and tell the people, look, in Hungary, every single individual, per capita gets 600 euro, destined for infrastructure projects. 600 euro per capita. That's a lot of money. Now, I don't know whether the Hungarians know about that. They probably have the feeling that the European Union is suffocating their country. Poland gets 50 billion a year. They are getting a lot from the European Union. Nobody is telling this story. So I think this is one of our challenges. Get the narrative right about the European Union. Stop this scapegoating. It's a responsibility of the leaders and of the media, but also of the citizens, engaged citizens that like Europe.
Well, that's why I asked you earlier if you thought that the German government need to sort of remind people that it's in their interest to stay within the EU. Are you suggesting that Ambassador O'Sullivan go back and say we need to launch a PR campaign so that the people in Hungary know that it's worth their time, that there is a vision to hold together this bloc and it's directly, benefiting them? Are you discussing that at Bratislava?
Well, listen, Margaret, you can't imagine how much we've discussed this in Brussels. There are a couple of people in the audience who know what I mean. We've had endless discussions like this, moderated by people like yourself, where we discuss how do we do better at selling Europe. My personal position has always been the following. The institutions are not best placed to sell the European Union to our citizens. It is national politicians who have to do it. They have to explain why it actually makes more sense to do certain things at European level than to decide it at the national level. Because that's what it comes down to ultimately. It comes down to that choice. You can manage something at the national level or indeed at the subnational level, or you can manage it at the European level, or indeed you can manage it at the global level if you want to go to the WTO or the UN. And we need a better explanation from national politicians about why this is, why it brings many benefits, and why, yes, there are sometimes constraints, that it comes with strings attached, that you don't have the same freedom of maneuver that you would have if you were not part of the European Union, but that on balance it works out better. Now, the UK have had that debate and have reached the conclusion that on balance they feel they would like to leave. I think that's personally the wrong choice, but I think it is a debate that any country has to have. And one of the reasons Article 50 was put in the Constitution and the Treaty of Lisbon was to make it very clear that indeed this was ultimately a possibility. If you really feel it's not working for you, you can decide you wish to leave. So I think it's not a question of a PR campaign, to be very frank, and I'm sure you didn't mean it in that way, but it's not a question of hiring a McKinsey to go out and say the EU is good for you. We've been through things like that in the past. It never works because people coming from the institutions are deemed to be too biased in their perception. It needs the national politicians to be more honest in explaining why sometimes it's better that certain things aren't decided at national level, but actually get decided and managed at European level to get better outcomes for our citizens. And that, I think, we really need people to do more of.
I think we're coming up on about 10 minutes left here. So I think probably 2 more questions.
Thank you. My name is Elliot Feldman. I'm a lawyer who practices international law and trade. And my question is for Ambassador Darroch. Have you considered yet, maybe a premature question, where the UK is as a successor state to the European Union in its relationships with other countries, such as, for example, the Canada-European Free Trade Agreement?
The short answer is that we haven't decided on that, and this is one of the they're both technical, but they're also highly political issues that will have to be worked out. Because if you look at the spectrum of options that face us as we approach the negotiations, you can end up with somewhere that, in terms of third country trade arrangements, looks really quite like what we have at the moment. And you can end up with somewhere at the other side of the spectrum where you have to start again with almost everyone. And I mean, I hate to sound like I'm ducking the question, but where we end up on that spectrum is work in progress and still to be decided. And if you read the British press, there are lots of different opinions on where you would want to be. So yes, we know that question is out there and it's going to be a big one, but no, we haven't taken a position on it yet.
Did you have a question? Sure.
The boss here.
Karen Donfried, GMF. I'm just back from California, and there were 14.5 billion reasons to think about Europe there if you were talking to folks in the tech industry. And they were seeing not a weak Europe, but an overly assertive Europe in terms of the European Commission's ruling that Ireland needed to claw back 14.5 billion from Apple due to tax avoidance. And I'm interested because Ambassador O'Sullivan is here representing the EU, but you are also an Irish citizen. The Irish government is appealing this. But also this question of tax avoidance has been a big issue for the member states. The UK has been a leading voice on this. Germany has lots at stake. How big an issue do you think this is going to be in the US-EU relationship and also among the member states? Thank you.
Well, I can assure you that the Irish government would not feel I speak for them on this issue, so I think there's no risk of that. Look, I think it's very important, and I know it's not easy in the United States because the concept of state aid is not part of your legal lexicon. But it's a very, very important part of European competition law because it basically was designed to prevent states from subsidizing uncompetitive industry. So it is a provision in the treaty which empowers the Commission with the authority to investigate any suggestion of illegal state subsidization of companies, which basically comes down to saying that if the aid is selective, if it is targeted at one company, it is not part of a general provision, it is considered illegal. This is a very important safeguard. It's been there since the treaty was first established in the Treaty of Rome. There is a long, long history of state aid cases taken against every member state, the 6 original, the 9 as we became, the 12, the 20, the 15, the 20, the 28. No country has escaped criticism on this. I think nearly every member state at some point or other has fallen foul of these rules. It's a well-established legal practice, very transparent, very open, always subject to judicial review, always goes to the court if the member state feels unfairly treated, and the court takes the final decision, and sometimes has found against the Commission's ruling, sometimes supports it. The decision on Apple is not about tax law. It is not about tax law. It is about the use of the tax code to provide an unfair subsidy to the company. Basically what the Commission is saying, that the way the Apple tax arrangements were set up with the Irish government resulted in Apple not paying tax, which was a benefit to Apple that was not fair to other companies who were paying the corporate tax. So it's not about whether the Irish tax law was 12.5% or 10% or 50%. It's about the fact that Apple wasn't basically paying almost no tax. And by the way, this was exposed in Senate hearings here in the United States. This debate started here. And it was after that, when this was exposed, that the European Commission said, oh, well, maybe we need to have a look at this. And they've been looking at a series of rulings across the European Union. And there have been other cases, as you know, Fiat, Starbucks, Google, there are other examples. This is the biggest because, frankly, the numbers are very big. You look at the amount of unrepatriated profits sitting out there from Amazon, it's a large amount of money. So this is the decision. I think it is generally well received in Europe as the correct decision. The Irish government doesn't agree, and they will take it to court, and we will see what the court finally decides in a few years' time. I don't think that it should cause undue tension between the United States and Europe. I think we've been very clear in explaining this to the United States. One of the complaints of the US Treasury in their white paper is that somehow we are trying to take tax dollars which should have gone to the US. Mm-hmm. Commissioner Versteeg was very clear. If you want to claim you can tax that money, go ahead and tax it. We have no problem. We're not arguing. If that money should not have been taxed in Europe but was tax due in the United States, that's fine. But as I understand it, under your existing tax rules, you can't tax that money. And we're saying as long as it's not taxed elsewhere, it needs to be taxed under Irish law, and the money is due to the Irish government. By the way, there has also been a suggestion that there may be other countries in Europe who potentially could have taxed that money. So we will see. That's a matter for tax lawyers to sort out as to where the money would ultimately fall due. It was booked by Apple in Ireland, and that's where the Commission has made their case. If the US changes the tax code and says this money should be taxed in the United States, that's fine. It'll be taxed in the United States, and there will be due credit taken in any taxes due to the Irish government. So I don't think that this should be an issue dividing Europe and the US. On the contrary, we've been firm allies in this entire debate about base profit erosion and about eliminating tax havens, and we've worked very closely in the OECD with the BEPS and in working. This is a global problem about multinational companies that are able to manipulate their tax bills in order to pay very little or to minimize tax. And this is not something which is good for the global economy. It's not good for our citizens, and that's what. But this is a very specific case of the application of the state aid rules. It's not about a tax decision. The tax was simply the vehicle by which an illegal state aid, it is claimed, was granted to Apple, and that's why the money is recoverable.
So do you not fear that this will have a chilling effect? I mean, certainly the Irish government does, but elsewhere in Europe, if you were suggesting there could be other claimants as well.
Well, no, I mean, I'm simply saying that there can be a debate at the end of the day about precisely where some of this should have been taxed, because what was happening was all the profits being made in Europe were being channeled through a shell company booked in Ireland.
Right.
We're simply saying, well, either the money is due to the Irish, or if someone else wants to say, well, actually those profits were made in our jurisdiction and should be taxed there, that's a different issue. But I don't think the global amount will be affected by the point at which it should have been taxed. As for the chilling effect, I mean, to be very frank, I think what global corporations are able to do in terms of minimizing their tax bill is extremely damaging to all our economies. because it is eroding the tax base in each of our countries and reducing the ability of governments to supply the goods and services which their citizens need. And this cannot be accepted. Everyone should pay their fair share of the tax bill. And the idea that multinational corporations, by virtue of their special situation, are able to manipulate that and pay a very low or virtually no tax is clearly something which is actually quite scandalous in the eyes of our public opinion. We're going back to the globalization argument. One of the things that I think our citizens feel is precisely that global corporations benefit from a sort of regulation-free world, whereas local small and medium-sized companies operating in our jurisdictions are paying all their taxes and they're playing by all the rules. So I think this is actually a very important joint EU-US effort which we've been undertaking for many years. This state aid ruling is a very specific subset of the problem because we've been able to establish that there was a very specific illegal subsidy given to one company via the tax code, but this should not get in the way of our very good cooperation in fighting tax evasion by global corporations on the international scene.
Ambassador Darroch, you had wanted to weigh in.
Just a couple. I don't want to comment on the particular Apple case simply because I just don't know enough about it. And I think David's greatly more knowledgeable. But just 2 quick points of more general nature. We believe in competition between tax regimes. We have one of the lowest corporate tax rates in Europe, but it has to be competition on a fair basis. Second point, we are strong supporters of the state aid rules in the European Union and the competition authority. Now, as David implied, we've lost judgments come out against us. And it's always a bit of a blow when it does, and sometimes you think about taking it to the court, sometimes you don't. But on balance, nevertheless, this is a force for good in the European Union structures and ensures that competition is fair and that governments are unfairly subsidizing their companies. So basically the state aid rules is a very good thing in the EU. Lastly, as everyone knows, we've had our own issues in the UK with some big multinationals and how they pay tax. So the nature of the problem that David describes is not far from unique to Apple and to Ireland.
So is this, if Ireland ups their corporate tax rate, as other European countries have long complained,
sorry, Margaret,
I know you're saying it's a subsidy
not.
issue you're talking about. This is a different question. You made clear this is a very specific
but
tax
why
subsidy.
would they increase their that's their decision, and no one is asking them to increase it?
No, but there has been debate within Europe for years, complaints that it was unfairly low to disadvantage other countries who also bid for the same business. Is there a conversation about that portion of it right now?
No, the only debate that is active, because tax rates are not, would require a unanimous decision at the level of the European Union. Frankly, there's no appetite amongst many of our member states to have a harmonization of tax rates. The only issue which is out there is a common corporate tax base, which would be to look at whether you shouldn't have an accounting system that tries to better harmonize how corporate profits get taxed across 28 jurisdictions. So it's not an attempt to harmonize the rates, but to have a more transparent system of how the accounting works for companies which are operating across several member states. That is a proposal that the Commission has made, is defending. A number of member states have great difficulties with it. The UK, I think, has certain problems with it. The Irish also have certain problems. And that debate will continue. It will ultimately require a unanimity, probably, to be agreed. But that debate is there. But there is no active idea at this point of trying to harmonize tax rates across sensitive issues, such as the only area where we do that is for value-added tax, sales tax, as you would call it, where we don't harmonize it, but we try to get a certain degree of common approach in this because of the extent its impact on trans-border movement of goods. But corporate tax rates are not up for harmonization anytime in the future, in my view.
Well, we've run out of time. Just as we found your passion at the end, and I regret not having it earlier. But I want to thank all three of you ambassadors. It was wonderful to have this chance to speak with you and to have questions from your audience here. Thank you for your participation as well.